On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
And I got into that church and I looked around, and there were people of all colors, all stations in life. And I looked around and I was just so inspired. And I left there realizing that if my funeral had been held that day, down the street, about 2 blocks away, congregation would be all people that by and large looked like me. And I knew that that wasn't the story I wanted to have told about my life, because I didn't believe that's who I was in my soul. And so if I wanted to have a better and more inclusive and more interesting funeral, I was going to have to get about doing some more interesting, intentional, out there things.
Dianne English builds bridges across difference. She is Executive Director of Community Building Initiative, whose mission is to achieve racial and ethnic inclusion and equity in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Before joining CBI, Dianne served as Executive Director of Mecklenburg Ministries, an interfaith organization fostering understanding, compassion, and justice. She has served as a board member for numerous civic and nonprofit organizations, including for Florence Crittenton Services and the Center for International Understanding. Dianne is a recipient of the UNC Charlotte Distinguished Service Award and the Mecklenburg Ministries 25th Anniversary Legacy Award. In this episode, we explore building community, racial inclusion and equity, and making a difference in the time and place you are in. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Dianne, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Dianne, you have been at the center of a conversation in Charlotte for well over 30 years. What is that conversation?
Well, it has many layers, and I came into it from one experience of being a homemaker mom, wanting to get into an area of activity, and I got into this conversation because I think you're right. There is a thread of conversation that ties a lot of what we've been seeing for the last 30 years evolve. And I think it has to do with the essential differences when you come into a new South City of looking at the history of a place, which was not my history. I'm not a Southerner. And, but coming into a place that has been shaped and impacted by the Southern experience and the Southern history. And watching the change take place, whether it's the economic boom, whether it's the changing demographics, whether it's the wrestling with newcomers, and not just from other countries, from other parts of the country, trying to resolve that essential thing of who we are and who belongs here, who has access to the qualities of life that so many others have easy access to. And so I think it could, some people say, finding our soul, and yet making space and place for the people who live here, who have lived here, who have roots here, and those who come in that we say we need to grow and thrive. So I think there's that tension of who are we going to be, and who are we going to be together, and who do we mean by us? If I could shape a conversation, it really is, what does it mean to be human together, and who do we include in that community?
Dianne, what is the Community Building Initiative?
Oh my, it is an organization now. It was not intended to be one. it came as a task force, which we know well in this city, as a response to a community crisis. And we had in 1997 police shootings, white officers, black motorists, black citizens. And we came very close to having the quintessential race riot, much different in some ways than what happened in 2016 here. But that was a time of reckoning for people who led and lived in this community. And we were at the precipice of having just a riot. And people stepped in to say, and a variety of people, a range of people, a diverse group of people stepped in to say, we need to do something about this. And they formed a task force, and it was intended to do its work in 9 months and then to go away. And, you know, Mark, the reality of that is even the existence of the task force played into the suspicion that many rightly have, that it was just intended to get things quiet and just to get things back to some kind of normalcy for people who had the position and power to create normalcy. And so at its very core, but it's been 20 years. And so we still wrestle as the community building initiative and the work we do about inclusion and equity. We still wrestle with the fact that for some, even the creation of this task force that has morphed into an organization, never intended to be an organization. It was to do its job. There was integrity to it, but to get things back to some balance, and then we would move on. But the people involved said, we've got more to do. And what we were teasing out at that time, and it's become more apparent, is that the things we have to do collectively, individually, organizationally, is to wrestle with what's in the ground in this community, what's deep in the ground of this community that gets stirred up whenever there's a crisis, a tension, a disagreement. We try to close schools. We try to build transportation access. We do most anything. And we find people being agitated, angry, resistant. And some will say, why are they so angry? And others will say, why are they so clueless? And the suspicion or the challenge is to not put those things back in the ground, not put what happened in September of 2016 back in the ground, pave it over, and move on, because it stays there, like Claude Alexander says, like toxic waste. And it sits there until the next impetus crisis, and it comes out. And it's so. In essence, CBI, Community Building Initiative, is intended to provide opportunities for individuals and organizations to work intentionally on being a more inclusive and equitable community in that regard. We use the words commitment and capacity. So we believe there's a twofold responsibility. One, commitment, you got to give a rip. And capacity, you need some skills. And also you need a cadre of people who also give a rip and have some skills.
Dianne, how does CBI go about its work?
That's a wonderful question, because we work with individuals, but most likely those individuals are tethered to an organization, a group, a network, some collection of people through which they can do the work. But it's individuals who can work for change in some organization, group, network, and then over time create a greater sense of inclusion and equity in our community. So that's the change model. Individuals impacting organizations or groups, impacting in the long term, community at large.
CBI has a variety of programs.
We do.
I'm wondering if you can speak to each one of these individually. Equity Dialogue Circles.
That's the newest, and it is based on the understanding that equity is not equality. Equity is focus on understanding why the systems and structures, the things that are in place in our community, produce inequitable outcomes. And so what we try to do in Equity Impact Circles is to provide opportunities for people to explore issues like racial equity and look at it in a way, not just at a personal level, but also to say what systems, what structures are in place that account for the inequitable outcomes so that we know that our community, our region, our country cannot survive or thrive if there are these deep inequitable outcomes, whether they be in education, transportation, healthcare, any number of things. And there's intersections. But so in the Equity Impact Circle, we have a small group of people who have an opportunity to explore together, not just their personal experiences, but what's going on in our community that makes some of these inequitable outcomes so predictable. And so, and do we believe that people's life expectancy, the outcomes they expect to have should be influenced by their identity group or their zip code? And if we find that problematic, then we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to interrupt what's going on. But it's really a very initial step. It's not the solutions. It's not that. It's getting people to acknowledge that there are systems that are at work and they don't work for everybody. We're doing something with a healthcare group this spring. We've done it with the LGBT group to talk about how the racial equity intersects with their world and their experience. We've done it with a group of lawyers. So it's just, how do you approach and leverage the influence or the opportunity you have to interrupt? Because bottom line, we know a community cannot survive if these inequities persist, and there's a reason why they exist.
Another one of your programs is called LDI. What is LDI?
Leadership Development Initiative, and that's a program that our good friend Octavia Sewell has created and has been offering through CBI for the last 18 years. We're getting ready to recruit for Class 18. And it's basically at its heart about organizational change. How do individuals who are staff or board leaders within organizations work to create more inclusion and equity within their organization? And the key competency is, how do I use myself to influence at the personal or professional level? And the hope is that in an organization, there's a bench of people who are prepared and equipped to do this kind of work and support one another. Years ago, Mark, it was my initial appreciation of it is that in a boardroom, for example, it should not have to be the person of color who calls the question. It should not be. If it is, there should be people in place who can stand with. And that was in the early years when everything was more black and white. They're a little different now in some ways, but that was one of the things that was compelling to me. How do we equip ourselves to be allies and call questions that are important for organizations? But we need courage and we need support to do that, always. Pairs come out of organizations. They stay together for a year. They look at ways that they're personally very impacted by this, but the hope is that they go back into their organization. And we're talking about corporations. We're talking about hospital systems. We're talking about public sector. We're talking about advocacy organizations. Go back into their organizations to say, what's our role in becoming more inclusive? Because if we do it, and if we do it well, we'll have an impact on the community, and the people we serve will be impacted in a positive way.
CBI also gives bus tours.
Oh, yes. You know, a bus tour is a bus tour is a bus tour. We started bus tours, I think we're getting ready to do our 100th bus tour. And it started, we have the good fortune of working with Tom Hatchett and John Howard, and now we're involving Kim Graham from the Housing Partnership. And we start in the center city, and we go to the Center City, East Side, West Side, and we use those three locations because they are key and core to so much of this community. Our history, how we've grown, how we've developed. We explore a variety of things. I mean, candidly, sometimes I'll say there's a reason why I-77 doesn't go through Myers Park Country Club. And it was very intentional. It wasn't intended to, and it wasn't going to. And that's not to judge anybody one way or another, except to say, be aware of how this community has developed, the decisions that were made years, decades, centuries ago that shaped how this community has developed. And what are we doing now that's going to move us in a more healthy, whole direction. But the bus tours are fascinating. So people who've lived here all their lives will get on the bus with us and go to Center City, East Side, West Side, see and learn things they've never known. Newcomers come in and say, I have an appreciation for this community that I didn't have. I understand what's in the ground here and why, what it's done, how it's influenced. I mean, how many people know that Trade and Tryon is a Native American trading route? And so if you understand that our origins, the very core, the very center of our city, was really an economic engine or route for the first Americans, it has the potential to shape how you see this community. We've got a great one coming up this week. It's the CMPD puts their recruits on the bus from the training academy in the hope that these young officers will see the community and the places where they may be serving in some new ways and the people that they will be connecting with in some new ways and feel themselves a part of something.
Dianne, CBI has been at this work for 20 years.
Yeah.
You have a variety of programs.
Yeah.
The North Carolina Justice Center Education and Law Project recently reported that Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools are the most segregated in North Carolina. The NAACP released a report last month showing that disparities in education, housing, economic opportunity, and poverty are widening in Charlotte. Are you making a difference?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take the results or the impact of hundreds of years, the origins of our country, the bedrock, and fix it? I would be delighted if I thought that were possible. I would be ecstatic if I thought this could be resolved in my lifetime. I have come to peace with the fact that it will not be, and that it is our opportunity, my opportunity, your opportunity to do what we can where we are when we have an opportunity to do so. Julius Chambers years ago was asked by a young lawyer in this city how it felt to watch everything he had worked for in terms of desegregating the schools unravel right before his eyes. And he stopped in his very special way and looked at that young man and said, I did what was mine to do when it was mine to do it. Now it's your turn. So I think the magic of his life to me is that he ended his life doing exactly what he did when he started his career. He was providing legal support to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. So it's discouraging, but it starts with the reality that what we have an opportunity, and I think what is exciting about this particular time is perhaps we've never had this same opportunity of actually looking at systems and structures and saying, there's a reason why we're having the troubles and the outcomes that we see. We have set this up intentionally and predictably from the get-go to advantage some and disadvantage others. Here's what's intriguing to me. One of the biggest hurdles is acknowledging, can we be a part of asking a fairly simple but very profound question? Can we, people who've benefited, that this country was organized from the get-go to advantage some and disadvantage others, and that at strategic times, at times of opportunity throughout our history, when we've needed workers, we've let them in. When we have needed the GI Bill, it did not provide home ownership to people who had served, men of color who had served in the service. So their inherited wealth, their ability to buy a home, any of these things. I don't need to wear a hair shirt. I don't need to apologize and feel guilty. I just need to acknowledge that this happened and that it has changed the life of a whole group of people. So what's my place in that? So I would say to your question, it is discouraging that we haven't made more progress, but we've made a lot of progress. And so the opportunity we have right now is to build on that. But the forces that we're facing, and why I still consider Charlotte to be a place of opportunity, we're not baked yet. We should be woke, as they say. Anthony Fox at a breakfast last December said, why did we need a study from Harvard to tell us what we already knew? But now that we know, you turn away at your peril. And so we can't.
Is acknowledgement of racist systems and structures enough?
Oh, no. No. You acknowledge, you analyze, and then you strategize to act. So many of us want to say, I'm tired of talk. I want to do something. And that's admirable. But if you want sustainable impact, we would suggest that you look at that continuum. Acknowledge where we are, why we are. Analyze to say, what's the data tell us? How do we understand what we're dealing with? And then, where do I have leverage? Where do we collectively? What can we do that we believe will move us in a more positive direction? So, no, acknowledgement isn't, but for some people, that's a real big, it's a hurdle to hop over.
Dianne, if CBI had greater resources, what would you do?
Well, that would be a gift. I think what we've done is to establish a platform. But we would move out beyond the programs we have. We have a strategy right now called Deep and Wide. And we want to go deeper with the people that we have engaged because we believe they're poised and equipped to do some really powerful things within their networks and collectively. We would go wider and enlarge our digital platform. We've redesigned it. And so that more people could be part of the network. So people could enter in their own way to explore what it might mean for them to be more intentional about connecting across difference. And that's a range of differences. And could you do it? Mark, we had an amazing response after the shooting in Charleston at Mother Emanuel. And we got started in providing dialogue guides for intact groups within organizations because someone called and said, we're falling apart over here. People come to work and they don't just leave it in the parking lot. They're broken up. They're, even the people of color who work here cannot talk with the white folks and the brown folks, and we need help. And most of us just need help in bridging some of those differences, especially at times of crisis when we're more prone to bond together around our pain. I heard someone say that this morning, it was Louis Anderson, say, we should have a good cry and a good laugh every day. And sometimes the world pushes us one way or the other. So CBI with its resources, we could reach more people and we could be more creative. We use what we got as creatively as possible. And I think we've done a credible job. But there are intersections, there are partnerships, there's all kinds of opportunity that could be realized. And that's not talking about an exorbitant amount of money. We're very responsible with what we have, but the need is great.
Dianne, why do you do this work?
Well, I think, there are lots of reasons, but one of the pivotal experiences, I think, that put me on this path, this particular path of working the way I have been for the last many years, I call my funeral story. I went to the funeral of Bruce Irons, who was an exceptional leader within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And his funeral was at Myers Park Baptist Church. He had an illness and died, sadly, much too young. And I got into that church and I looked around and there were people of all colors, all stations in life. And I looked around and I was just so inspired. And I left there realizing that if my funeral had been held that day, down the street, about 2 blocks away, congregation would be all people that by and large looked like me. And I knew that that wasn't the story I wanted to have told about my life because I didn't believe that's who I was in my soul. And so if I wanted to have a better and more inclusive and more interesting funeral, I was going to have to get about doing some more interesting, intentional, out there things. And so it just, to be inspired by I was inspired by the funeral. It was a celebration of a life well lived. And I thought, I'm missing something and I'm not doing what I need to do.
Dianne, I understand you grew up in many places.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe your childhood?
I think it was fairly traditional. I mean, it was the only childhood it was my childhood. But I think it was shaped by these different moves we made. I was born on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and my father, he was an accountant, and then he decided to go to seminary. And we say it was Mother probably who pointed out the burning bush, and it was time for him to take another approach. But he was always a businessman. But he went to Union Theological in New York, and so that moved us to Brooklyn. And we lived in an interracial neighborhood. And there was a young African-American boy that I was a friend to, and he died. And I don't remember a lot about my childhood. I remember the sadness of that time. And then we moved to Long Island, where my father had a small church, in a fire station, and he'd have to go on Sunday morning and sweep out all the beer of the night before the church could be. But then they built a church, and then we moved to north of Chicago when he was doing some work with the internal church. He started working around temperance and economic justice and things like that. The Swifts meatpacking, why the more humane slaughter of animals, that became an issue for the Methodist Church. And so the seeds of social activism were really put into our family's life. He marched with Dr. King. He was jailed in Shreveport. So I started learning about those kinds of things. But I lived a very I wasn't involved in the civil rights movement. So I think in many ways, Mark, I've been paying my dues. I missed the movement. I went off to college after we moved to D.C. and, majored on being cute. And I don't know that I was very successful, but I do know that there is a missing piece in my story in terms of the movement. So my childhood was that. It was based around education, getting a good education so you get a good job. It was based in a family that was both very practical around community or civic or issues of consequence, but also intensely spiritual. My mother was quite gifted in that regard. And so it was an interesting mix, a good childhood.
Dianne, your dad did live this life as an activist. Mm-hmm. As you think back on his life today, mm-hmm. What does he mean to you?
Well, there's so many questions I would ask him. So I would say to people, ask the questions you might expect you would want to ask. But there are things that I would love to know from him. He was a complex man, fascinating and full of life. I think of the qualities that I admire most in his life that I hope is part of mine is that's of curiosity. He was fascinated by all manner of things. And in terms of the work he did, I think the question of why things are the way they are. And he was involved with the Methodist Church during the Kent State Massacre. He wasn't an American, but he came to this country and embraced this American dream and the rights and the values of human beings. And so even in something like Kent State and then in the civil rights movement, asking the questions when they would take a Methodist conference to Dallas, why can't the people of color stay in your hotel? Why can't they do that? And if they can't, we're not coming. And so being willing to ask these tougher questions, being able to look at systems and say, there's something wrong here. So I think it's that curiosity and it's the ability to maybe ask that second level question.
And tell me about your mom.
I didn't have her long enough. She died when I was 25. It's hard for me to talk about her even now. And yet if she were sitting next to me, she'd just pinch my knees and say, buck up, stop that. She was full of life. She was very gifted spiritually and lived in that realm, but she was very practical, Canadian. She was very, very grounded. She was just an inspiration because she was so much a part of making a day mean something. I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. She didn't concede. With the physical issues that she faced, her cancer, in a variety of ways, for deprivation at early years, she didn't concede because she believed life was too valuable and too precious. And it was a legacy of what people owe to each other and to themselves and to the Spirit of God that lived within her.
In describing your dad and your mom, are you describing Dianne English?
Don't I wish? But I do think there is something, that's a lovely way to ask the question. But I do think there is that internal and external, the balance, or trying to find a balance in our lives in terms of what's at our core, who we believe we've been created to be, what gifts we've been given, the advantage of having had good parents and a good family, and to be loved. And so I think there is that. How do we hold that core? And then how do we find places of service? The Methodist Church is a good one. John was an internal revolution with the social conscience. So I think there's that kind of balance of the internal and the spiritual and the secular. But more than that, it's believing that this world is a place for which we are stewards, and we are stewards of one another.
You went to UNC Chapel Hill.
For 2 years.
What did you study?
Education. They didn't have a space in physical therapy, so I chose education. I went there for 2 years after 2 years at Emory in Atlanta, and it was moving into the quintessential university environment. So that's how I became a Tar Heel. And it surprises me that I got back here to live, because I was only there in Chapel Hill for 2 years.
How did you find your way to Charlotte?
First husband. First husband kind of deposited me in Charlotte, and here I was with 2 children, and it just surprises the dickens out of me that I'm still in Charlotte, because it wasn't the place I chose, but in some ways it choose me, perhaps. I think that's how I got here. Why I've stayed is, you could say it's inertia, but I found that it's a place where you can do some really good work. And I do believe, as I said before, it's not baked yet. And so I'm curious about what it can be. I'm frustrated at times, really frustrated. And yet, it's just this opportunity. For a long time, I didn't feel like it was home. I now, when I drive back in and I see the landscape, I think I'm coming back home. You know, when you think about where is your home, often it's where your roots are, or where your family is grounded. My family is not grounded in Charlotte, my family of origin, or the South. So it's kind of a strange situation, you know, in terms of where is home and why I'm still in Charlotte, and could I be doing this someplace else? I'm happy being here, and curious and committed.
Dianne, you became executive director of Mecklenburg Ministries. How did you find your way there?
Well, Sidnor Thompson really found me, and he needed some people to help Mecklenburg Ministries when it was getting started. I think it was mainly bringing cookies to a reception. And so I got connected to it and joined the board. And then when there was a staff change, I became an interim and then was hired as director. So I was there for 7 years. And that's when so much of the work around race really got started. And I think, Mark, what I basically did with MecMin is to show up and continue to show up at community meetings where race was at the core, making connections with people and congregations and communities. It's where I learned that I was much more comfortable or on Beatties Ford Road than Ballantyne, because I didn't go to no judgment on Ballantyne, but my locus was in congregations around the city. And so it was a remarkable opportunity to look at, even from the connection around family. How do you use your faith? How does your faith prepare you or equip you or provide you a platform for doing work in the community? So it was a great opportunity for me.
In 1997, you moved from Mecklenburg Ministries to CBI.
Right.
And we talked about the launch of CBI. One of the signature programs of CBI was Crossroads Charlotte. What was Crossroads Charlotte?
Well, it was really a program of Foundation for the Carolinas and Knight Foundation that CBI helped manage. Crossroads came as the result of the initial social capital survey that said that Charlotte ranked very high in some aspects of social capital, philanthropic giving, associational involvement, but very low in terms of interracial trust. And so Crossroads is built in terms of engaging organizations and individuals around what kind of future we wanted to see. To me, the lasting legacy of Crossroads that's still in the ground in this community is the continuum of in order to build trust, you don't start out by saying, I want to trust you, or you need to trust me. It's the continuum is access, having a shot, inclusion, being part of the effort in an authentic way, and then equity, having access to resources and being able to play. And so when we hear a lot of the words around access, putting the word access into this community's thought process, that can be tethered right back to Crossroads. The other thing that's, I think, is still essentially valuable about Crossroads were the two component parts. It is self-interest. What's in it for me that this community be more inclusive and equitable? What's in it for me and my organization that we champion those values? And then what's the collective responsibility? Because one organization, one individual, one entity cannot do this, cannot move us to the more aspirational. And so you see in Leading on Opportunity, the overarching factors or influences of social capital and segregation, those are part and parcel of the work that Crossroads began.
Dianne, tell me about Roger English.
Roger. I married Roger in 1978, and I had come through a very hard time, but I had made some real strides in terms of who I knew myself to be. And Roger came along and just confirmed those things, the things I was learning about myself. And I think that was the hallmark of who I've often said, I married him and then I fell in love with him. And because I knew we could live together. I had 2 children, and he loved them and they loved him. And I knew he would bring good things into their lives, and he brought good things into my life. And we had a child together who was just a pure gift. Not every day, but, on balance. And we built a life together. And then 10 years in, he was diagnosed with a motor neuron disease. And for 26 years, we lived with that. Not always gloriously, but we did it effectively. And he said when he was diagnosed that we would learn some important things through that experience. And Lord knows we did. We were never abandoned. There were some really dark times. He had PLS, which is on the spectrum of ALS. The diagnosis of PLS is good news and bad news. The good news is it's not ALS. The bad news is it's not ALS because it lasts a long time. But what I learned and what the gift I was given was to know I was impacted by it, but I was not confined by it. And the hard reality of living with chronic illness, from my standpoint, is just that. You have to determine that it is not my illness. And that sounds harsh, but he didn't ask me to assume his illness. But we learned how to navigate and to keep our family together. He was he had the cleanest core. I said it was like his internal gyroscope. He had the most exquisite internal core. He knew what was valuable and what wasn't. He was a man of few words. And then when he couldn't talk anymore, he was a man of no words. So it was, I wouldn't, someone said, if you'd known what was going to happen, what would you do? I said, well, I'm glad I didn't. Because we did, it was not easy, but it was the life I was given to live. And I will always be grateful that he was part of my life.
How do you think your life at home with him informed your work in the community?
That's a very, very, it's a challenging question. I think sometimes what it provided was, I know my work provided a place in which I could be me. And so that idea of being impacted but not defined. And I think most of us in our lives, if we live long enough, we'll come to grips with that. There's a prevailing circumstance, there's a issue, it could be internal, it could be external. Something that we have to wrestle with. And how we see ourselves at several levels and yet still try to be whole as a whole person requires, at least for me, not compartmentalizing, but in some ways, yes, finding out who I'm being called to be. The beauty of Roger is that he never blamed anybody for his illness. He just didn't. And so we didn't have to take that on. He wasn't angry, overtly angry. And so that wasn't the person I had to respond to. I could have. And so there was a freedom in that, and yet an anchor. And so I think maybe I devoted myself, or I poured myself into my work in some ways because I was free to do that. And that sounds like a contradiction. But I also, I lived a fairly simple life. I lived a fairly simple and solitary life, even though I was part of a community effort. So the work was a gift in the midst of something that I would not have chosen to go through, nor would have he. So it's the life I was given to live. And I have some questions about it. I mean, I do have some questions. If James Howell says, if I eke my way into heaven, I do have a few questions, but here we are. And, on balance, I've been a very fortunate person.
I understand you have 2 sets of twins as grandchildren.
I do. I've got 8 grandchildren, and I have the twins that are almost 10 and the twins that are 2.5. And then there are 4 other just absolutely stunning children. So yes, there is something very, very fabulous about these grandchildren, and, hopefully we'll continue to get along well. I love being their Dee Dee.
Dianne, you have a group of close friends: Susan Patterson, Octavia Sewell, Emily Zimmern. What do they mean to you?
Well, friends are sustaining, and friends with whom you can share experiences and learning and laughter and anger, irritation, adventures. They think big. They are very grounded in terms of what matters. It's a gift to have people that you can be yourself with. And over a period of time, we all work together. Work brought us together. And I think just friendship and connection, and we travel well together. We all have our different roles. I'm responsible for snacks. I don't know how that happened, but I'm responsible for snacks. Others are responsible for other more profound areas of making the trips possible. So yeah, and I've had throughout my life a not huge band of friends, a lot of wonderful people. And I think that's that's what gives life meaning. I like my quiet, my solitude, but the privilege, and I think that's one of the things that's made my work so wonderful, the privilege of knowing and meeting and seeing people who are really, they're working hard, they care a lot. Most of them know how to laugh. And I don't know that I would have without, and so with the friends you mentioned and with others, how do we see the bizarre in life? How do we make sense out of what we've been given to wrestle with, or the world in which what are the questions that we can share together? And that binds us together.
What do you know for certain?
I know that I'm a child of God. I know that I have never been abandoned. I know that I've been gifted. And most days I know that I'm loved.
Thank you for your time today, Dianne.
Thank you for making time.
Dianne English is Executive Director of Community Building Initiative in Charlotte, North Carolina. She earned a BA in Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And now, a personal word. When I asked Dianne what she knew for certain, She closed her eyes and paused for what seemed a long time. I sat across from her. I could see a wave of emotion come over her as her eyes remained closed and became tearful. Then she answered in almost a whisper. She knew for certain that she was a child of God, that she had never been abandoned, that most days she was loved. I think of the work to which Dianne has devoted nearly her entire adult life, the daily, often exhausting work of racial reconciliation and knitting the ties that bind. What does it take to do that work? To stay at it through moments of crisis and when the community is tired of the conversation. To raise the question of inclusion and equity in boardrooms and workshops and public meetings when those at the table no longer want to hear it. To speak about systems and structures that seem beyond the ability of any one person to change. Looking at Dianne across the table, as her eyes were closed, I saw a person both weary and resolute. Someone who has been tested, but who knows she is embraced. She knows that she does not walk alone. Dianne is a person of faith, and it takes faith to heal our wounds. Dianne spoke of what's in the ground, how years of segregation and injustice became the color of law, how explicit government policies ensured the separation of Black and white persons, how discriminatory policies have had a devastating effect on our community. It is all in the ground, in low interracial trust, in our misunderstanding of motives, in our miscommunication across difference. How do we get it out of the ground? We get it out of the ground by digging it up, by reaching our hands into the earth, by tilling the soil. Unpleasant things are stirred when we do, but unless we do, we cannot plant new seeds that will sprout, plants that will grow, flowers that will bloom. There are these houses I drive by on Sharon Road. They have perfectly manicured lawns. The lawns are regimented, uniform, disciplined, tamed. Evenly cut blades of grass announce the status quo. Interrupting these houses is a small home with a wild garden. It is a sight to behold. Rocks, leaf cups, violets, myrtles, dandelions, daisies. The garden is an explosion of nature, twisting and turning, filled with the sound of birds and pollinating bees. It must drive the owners of the manicured lawns nuts. I smile every time I drive by. Dianne English interrupts our sensibilities. She asks questions that disturb the status quo. She does so with confidence in things hoped for and with love of things unseen. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Crittenton, Art and Media Director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.